All right, so we're sitting with Gerald Cedillo. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I attended the University of St. Thomas here in Houston, as well as the University of Houston. I studied under a lot of amazing poets there in the creative writing department. Nick Flynn, Tony Hoagland, some of my favorite teachers, taught me a lot. I completed a thesis there, and I'm finishing it up this summer. My first book of poetry.
So what drove you to poetry? Why are you a poet?
Why am I a poet? Wow, that's like why are you left-handed? That's just something it's hard to describe. I've always been interested in the arts. I come from an artistic family. My father's very artistic, and I got into. My start was in theater, actually. And being an actor, it's really difficult because you're always working with someone else's material. You're always working with what's given to you, and you have a hard time. You can't really create your own stuff to perform on stage anyway. In a production, it's really difficult to do that. And I discovered slam poetry through punk rock music, actually. Saul Williams, he's a touring poet, one of the biggest poets now of all time, actually. And I discovered his books, I discovered his stage performances. He had a website with this big thriving community on it where people can come and post their own poems and get critiques and criticism and stuff. Post videos of their performance, their slam. So that's how I got into it, and then from there I just kept writing. So I feel like I came into poetry pretty late, actually. It was maybe senior year of high school when I started seriously thinking about writing and the craft.
Okay. You said you were putting together a collection, a poetry collection. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I'm putting together a full-length book of poems, which is based off of some of the politics and political history that's going on in the last couple of years. It's based off of the presidential candidate John Edwards and his affair that got him kicked out of the race, the presidential race. He was cheating on his wife with this woman. He was taking money out of his campaign to take care of that. His wife was also at home with cancer. She was battling that while he was in this race for the presidency and keeping a mistress on the side. I think that's just a great metaphor for America in general. So I'm writing about that. I have some personal experiences with those sort of things, those issues. So I'm finishing that book up. I'm also working on 2 chapbooks, smaller, just paper-bound books that I'm probably going to get printed online or something somehow. Submit those to some contests. Those are going to be wrapped up hopefully by this summer as well.
Okay. Have you got a publisher set for your collection, or?
I don't. I'm going to go the route of contests. I'm going to submit them online, submit them to people I know, try to get them into juried contests where people are paid to sit down and read it. And hopefully from there I'll get noticed, recognized. So.
Okay. You said you did readings. Is there a specific poem that people like to hear when you do your readings? Is there something that you get requested to do?
Not really. I don't really memorize my work anymore. I used to, a good deal. And so in this little community in the Houston arts poetry scene, I used to get requests. I used to be a little bit more familiar with my memorized work. More performance-based poetry. But now, since I'm more dedicated to writing on the page, keeping it on the page, I just read from the page whenever I go to readings, whenever I go to different poetry events. And so I'm trying to always read new material. During several festivals, several tours that I've gone to recently, I've made it a habit of writing for each festival, for each event, to keep it fresh, to keep it new. I was fortunate recently in that I had all of my poetry stolen from me. I was carrying all my poetry around with me in a satchel, in a bag, and somebody broke into my car and stole the satchel. It looked like a laptop bag, so I guess they expected to find some really good swag in there that they could take to a pawn shop. Instead, they just found years and years worth of journals, and they were probably very disappointed. Anyway, I consider that a pretty bittersweet experience because now it's forcing me to actually, write more and more new material, try and, play catch up, fill out these journals. So yeah. So no, I don't have any requested poem or anything. I have my favorites.
Okay. You just opened up with an exhibition at the Galleria Regina. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I met the artist Lorena Morales through a friend. I'm an organizer for several different festivals here in Houston, literary festivals. And a friend of mine met up with Lorena, and Lorena said that she had been looking for a poet to work with. So we met, we introduced each other, we started working immediately, and I would combine poems to her art pieces, to her paintings. It was supposed to be just a small exhibit at the beginning, just a small little experiment. But as we started working together, she started liking what I was doing. I was helping her in her process, thinking about her pieces a little bit more. And it became this real true collaboration. It was really wonderful. So it became the entire exhibit. We worked for about 2 months. I finished about 40 poems to her pieces, which is about the length of a book. And in fact, we're talking now about trying to get it into a book format, as well as moving the exhibit around different places. So, yeah, it was a wonderful experience. I've never done anything before like that. I have worked with ekphrastic art before, which is just, writing to another type of art form. Be it a movie or sculpture, dance, something like that. So I've done stuff like that before, but never at this length, never this dedicated. So it was a really wonderful, unique experience, and hopefully I'm going to have some different projects like that in the future. Some things are in the works right now.
You said you wrote about 40 poems, and you also say you're trying to keep things fresh, to keep things moving. During that whole process, did you ever get burned out?
Burned out? Well, not burned out, but I got terrified. Sure. Because of her artwork, it's very different from what I'm used to. Her art is very minimal, and it's very just abstract. I'm used to writing narrative, I'm used to writing stories, descriptions, and so that's nothing that I was really familiar with, or I didn't really know how to approach that, and because it scared me, actually, is why I convinced myself I had to do it. So what I did is it took me to different links. I had to relearn my craft, relearn what inspired me, what I was interested in, and try to approach it from different writing. I went to a lot of Eastern poetry, a lot of haiku, a lot of Rumi, and a lot of Middle Eastern ancient poetry. Very simple, stark images and phrases, stuff like that that didn't really tell a story, but just conveyed a lot of emotion. So that's what I tried to do.
Okay. There was a comment recently that said poets were afraid to move outside of their comfort zone. It sounds like you've really gotten outside of that since you came across this endeavor, and it was kind of a little terrifying for you. For what you've experienced in the poetry world today and in the poetry scene, do you think the poetry world's gotten a little stale?
A little stale? It's like anything else. There are several large chunks of people, large groups that are going to be, cloistered, that are going to be in their own clique, in their own community. So yeah, it's like anything else. There are chefs, there are world-class chefs who go and, work at soup kitchens, and then there are world-class chefs who only want to stay in their one, restaurant and go for their world-class Michelin stars or whatever. So it's like any other enterprise or experience, hobby, any gift. I think locally, what I would say is there's a strong focus of people who are committed to making art, poetry as open and as public as possible. Like I said, I'm fortunate enough to work with a group of organizers who do the word around town, who do the Beat Poetry Festival, who do the Houston Poetry Festival. And these organizations are dedicated, Imprint as well, are dedicated to bringing poetry to the people, bringing it, to the corner, to the street. And so I feel very much, I feel very important. Scratch that, edit that. I feel very importantly about that. So I think it's very important. Then there are other people, there are other types of people, there always will be, who just want to hone in and focus on their craft, on their trade. And that's fine. I mean, we need both. We need the crazy eccentrics who are out there just tinkering away, the Edisons who are working in their laboratory all the time, trying to invent something new. And then we also need the Neil deGrasse Tysons, who are trying to, explain what it is that the Edisons have been doing all those years, So you need the geniuses in the workshop, but you also need, the translators, the man on the street. I don't know which is better, if there is a better, but I think they're both very necessary, especially to keep art alive and thriving. I think they're both necessary.
Some poets that I've talked with said that there's a large divide between slam poetry and page poetry. That slam poetry brings an interest to the world of poetry, but it's bringing it in a different light. Like, it's not bringing it to full attention, basically. It's sort of, I guess you could say that some poets are a little irritated with slam poetry stealing the light, I guess, if that's what you want to say. How do you feel about those comments?
I don't believe so. I don't believe that's the case at all. Slam poetry is just a style. It's just a format. Just a way to experience, another way to experience poetry. That's it. It doesn't exactly have its own rules. I mean, it can be just as beneficial, just as engrossing, just as enriching as anything that you can find on the page. And sometimes more so. And then I can also throw that claim back at, so-called academic poets or page poets, for not, like you said, trying to embrace an audience, not trying to reach out, stifling themselves with too much thought, too much, consciousness, too much density. And that's just as stifling. Slam poetry is a lot of, for whatever you want to say, and even the most negative detractors of slam poetry would have to admit that it has brought enormous amount of attention to the scene, to poetry. And at the end of the day, whatever makes a little kid open up a book, whatever gets somebody interested in this, in words and experiencing themselves, in expressing themselves, then it's all good. And really, that's what it is, trying to open people up, open minds. And expressing yourself, really. And you can do that on the stage, you can do that in a journal, you can do that, on a chalkboard and never show anybody. But if you're expressing yourself, then that's a form of art, you're coming towards that. And that's what's important.
Okay. Let's go on ahead and define poetry. What's poetry to you?
What is poetry? I'm glad that you started off with the easier questions, right? What is poetry? Poetry, like anything else, poetry is a tool. It's an art, but it is a tool. It's like fencing. Language, just grammar, mechanics. I always compare that to like sword making. That's like the hammer and tongs on the anvil. That takes a lot of work. And then, when that's done, when you folded your sword over 1,001 times, then you can start the art of fencing. Just making it beautiful, making it deadly, making it sharp, making it precise. I was told that poetry, one of my favorite poets, Willie Perdomo, says poetry has three purposes: to witness, to record, and to celebrate. So this is what the tool is for. You have hammers and nails that, sink pieces of woods together. You have an engine that, can make a vehicle run. And poetry is the emotional engine. It's a tool that allows us to know where we are in a precise moment, what we're feeling at a time, in a certain time, to be introspective. That's what it is. It's a tool for introspection. The art of it comes when we bring that introspection and show it to others. When we say, this is what I've done, this is how I've delved into myself, how I've mined for my own emotions and thoughts and notions and ideas, and I want to show you. That's when it becomes art, when you present it to an audience, when you give it to others. Because you can make bird cages in your house, and if you never let a bird live in it, then what's the use, right? So the art becomes when you take it out into the real world. And so that's something of what poetry is. So to go back to your earlier question about slam poetry, again, that's just another form of the art. It's a larger hammer. And if that art is still using the same thing, if it's still used in the same way to, slam down these metaphorical nails, these troubles, these issues that bother us, then what's the problem? Right? Then what can the harm be if it's still used in the same way? That tool is still useful.
Throughout this process of interviewing all these different poets, I've not come across a single, scratch that, I actually have come across a single poet that said that poetry is dead.
Really?
Yes.
Who is that? Name it.
I'm not going to do any naming on camera, but their video is posted and it can be viewed on YouTube. But they didn't say it's dead. They said it's dead and it's not dead. It's definitional. Market-wise, yes, it's dead. But you can still sort of make a living off of it if you go through MFA programs and things of that nature. So I guess my question here is, do you feel that poetry is dead? And more importantly, do you feel that there's a market for poetry?
Okay, well, I'm going to start with the second part of that question first. Is there a market for poetry? Markets are a funny thing. I'm not an economist, but what I do know is poetry has outlived nations, empires. And also, what market, right? If we go outside of the United States, if you go to South America, if you go to Central America, if you go to the Middle East, or even in Europe, poetry is thriving. Not just book sales, not just websites, but in-person competitions. They have singing and poetry recital competitions that fill up stadiums. They sell records and albums. Not only is it thriving, it's still a tool that is being used for immense power. Poetry in the Middle East, poetry in China, poetry in Russia during the Ukrainian Revolution. These things, these words are literally changing empires. They're bringing down tyranny. They're bringing down, dictators. People are still very much afraid in the world, are still very much afraid of the power of words and the power of thought. They're still very much afraid of this. The pen is mightier than the sword is an old adage, but it's still true. So if you mean American markets, in North America, is poetry as lucrative as it used to be in, say, 70 years ago? No. But what I compare poetry to is, say, comic books. 70 years ago, if you said comic books was going to be a thriving industry, people would have literally laughed you out of the country. The Adventures of Superman in the 1930s were two Jewish immigrants who arrived in America, were penniless. They started this comic strip that went nowhere for another 10 years. And even then, comic books were still seen as being this childish thing, this 5-cent dime store thing that came out in the newspapers every Sunday, and there's going to be no future in it. And even then, they were looked at as even, backwards. They were gross. They were indecent. They said things that children, shouldn't be learning or picking up. They weren't allowed in schools and things like that. Now, comic books are not only a thriving industry, they're the mainstay of the movie industry, of television, of internet. People are devoted to these things. They're followers. Do I think there's going to be a poetic summer blockbuster anytime soon? Maybe not. But I mean, in America, the market has come and gone and come again. And so I don't think there should be any worry for that. Now, as far as the vitality of the art form itself, poetry, I would just have to go back to, people love announcing the death of things, but I don't think there's any reason for that. 1882, Nietzsche said that God is dead, and if you were to do a documentary on that, I think many people would physically, confront you on that, because it's not. Ideas don't die. Walt Whitman said in section 3 of Song of Myself, he said, I have heard what the talkers are talking, the talk of the beginning and the end. But I do not talk of the beginning and the end. There was never any more inception than there is now. There was never any more youth or age than there is now. And there will never be any more heaven or hell than there is now. Never any more perfection than there is now. Urge and urge and urge. Always the procreant urge of the world. He talks about a lot of things in that section, but what I relate to that is that we always want something new. We're always looking for the new, bright and shiny thing, when the simple truths, the simple, basic, fundamental parts of our being have yet to be unfulfilled, like religion, like who we are, our identity, our self-consciousness. I was mentioning earlier how poetry is still causing revolutions in the world. And that's part of it. You talk about markets. The world is always trying to corrupt art because the world wants business. It wants those new things. It wants new toys. It wants to create more markets. And art, poetry, is completely adverse to that. It's revolutionary. It's countercultural poetry because there's no stock market in that. There's no leverage in that. You can't brand a poem or a poet. Not really. So those are always opposing ideas. The capitalism of America and the hippiness, the feel-goodness of poetry and art. But that's good. There should be opposition to that. And as long as there is those ideas of freedom and liberty, then there will be poetry. Listen, as I was saying about revolutions happening because of words and those ideas. It was capitalism. It was venture capitalism and stock market companies that explored the world. But it was poets and philosophy and the ideas of empathy and liberty that freed it. So there will always be that need.
So poetry starts revolutions in other countries. So here in America, do you feel that there are poets that are out there rallying against hot-button American issues?
Yeah. Oh, definitely. There are a ton of poets. Off the top of my head, I'm still thinking of Saul Williams, Andrea Gibson. These are performance poets who speak out on issues. You would be hard-pressed to find any notable poet, academic or otherwise, who isn't, for the most part, extremely vocal and political and liberal. Margaret Atwood is one that I was just reading. She's an activist and environmentalist. There are poets who have spoken in front of Congress. There are poets who are promoting all kinds of rallies and petitions. Poetry is a very political process. It is by nature. But we're still asking the wrong questions. Because, nobody asks, why aren't football players helping the political process anymore? Nobody asks why authors of cookbooks haven't brought about world peace yet. It's not the business of poetry to change the world. It's the business of poetry to find a meditative space, a private thought, a private conversation with yourself. That's what that is. And then if from that conversation with yourself you want to change the world, then that's some good that is being done. Then the poetry art has made its mark. It's done its job.
Let's talk a little bit about independent presses, small presses, and self-publishing. Chapbooks are normally up to the poet to publish themselves. They get themselves printed. They use websites like Lulu, CreateSpace, a lot of online places.
Yeah.
What are your feelings towards self-publishing, and what are your feelings towards the independent publishing market?
Sure. Well, first of all, there are a lot of major houses that are now going towards chapbooks and smaller forms of publishing because they see that it's necessary. They see that there's a demand for that people want that. As far as independent publishing, I've looked into it a lot. I've not done it myself yet, but I think it's wonderful, especially if it's with a label that is dedicated to poets. Dedicated to local new voices, things like that. It's wonderful. The internet age has changed the way publishing is looked at, and for the best. Which means people like me can be read, which is good, which is beneficial. It makes it a little bit more democratic, which I need.
The internet has made a lot of things easier. I can go to McDonald's up the road and get on Wi-Fi with my iPad and search anything I want to. There was a comment that said that the internet has watered down poetry because anyone can go online, make a blog for free, and post whatever they want to. What are your feelings towards that statement?
I think that's ridiculous. The internet has... there's the rule that, there's that cynic's rule of the internet that says 99% of everything is crap anyway, right? So all that's allowed is for the the amateurs, for the people who need Prozac rather than poetry, to go online and say what they feel, say whatever they want. You can just look at any comment board or forum to know that there are tons of wackos who should not have be allowed access to a keyboard to know that there's going to be some bad poetry out there. But the fact that I can go online and look up, an 1,000-year-old poem by Rumi by just typing in the first 3 words of it, that's pretty fascinating. And that power is always going to be for the best. So it's watered down a lot, but it's also made a lot of things a lot more powerful because you can connect online. You can strengthen your trade. You can workshop. You can hone your skills. You can meet with actual talented, published, accepted poets, lauded poets. I'm Facebook friends with Franz Wright, who teaches at UT. And there's no reason in the world I should be allowed near that man. But much less, being able to say hello to him, wish him a happy birthday. But I am, and I haven't done it, but I know several poets who have sparked up conversations and friendships, and gone out to meet these people, and that's the way it should be. That's there have always been, especially in the heyday of poetry and writing in the 40s and 50s and 60s, when novelists were on the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. There were always these fans. There were always these people who would knock on the door of a poet's or an author's house, just to talk to them and just to will you read my manuscript and things like that. And that's all the internet is. It just brings a forum for those people to come out. And I gotta admit, I was one of those guys too. Like I said, I was on the Saul Williams website. I was putting my horrible high school poetry online that should not have ever seen the light of day. But I stuck to it, and I was critical of myself. Fortunately, I had some friends online who were critical of me as well, and it sharpened my wit. It made me try harder. So there is a benefit for it.
Let's talk a little bit about events. You do the World Around Town tour. There's the Houston Poetry Festival. Austin International Poetry Festival just happened about a month or two ago. There was a comment that was made that says these events are great. They're wonderful, but it sounds like it's only reaching poets. It's not really reaching the general public. Can you give us your thoughts on that statement, and can you give us some idea of how the events that you've helped grow and make happen reaches the general public?
Sure. Well, first of all, these festivals, yes, they do. For the most part, only reach their very narrow audience. But again, it's the type of question that we're phrasing, right? Nobody goes to Topeka, at the real estate insurance convention and it's like, hey, real estaters, we need to get out into the real world. We need to let the average Joe into our conference and see exactly how to help, change the market, right? Some of these festivals are specifically for writers because they're for the tools that a writer or, a seasoned poet or somebody who's interested in the very fine details of publication and mechanics and revision processes like this that most people aren't interested in, right? Unless you have a very fine-tuned attitude about this or whatever. So I mean, just for that, there's these conferences that are designed for a more seasoned veteran or a more seasoned poet. Secondly, if you wanted to, there are ways to get public interest involved. I've been involved with activities and festivals where, we go to local high school performances, we go to community centers. The Word Around Town focuses on going to public places, bars, restaurants, coffee shops, places where we will encounter general audiences, where there's a crowd, there's a draw coming in for something that isn't art. And, just like the way a restaurant puts up art on the wall with a tag priced on it, hopefully somebody will walk in and see a poet reciting something and they'll say, oh, that's interesting. What is that? I've never encountered that. So yeah, I mean, this guerrilla style is something that, all poets should be familiar with. But again, it's not always necessary. I find it very important to try and reach a broader audience. But I mean, it's not always something that you can do. Because of what poetry is, people usually have to come to it. You have to come seeking it out. It's like religion. People, for whatever you want to say, and they're allowed to, but you don't really listen to the street preacher, holding the Bible at the corner of the intersection yelling at people. But if you're so inclined, if you need it, you should be able to walk into a church at any time. And that's what poetry is. That's my church. That solitude, that introspection. So more often than not, it requires an audience to come to it, a reader to come ready to listen and to hear it. So yelling and screaming into people's ears as much as you want isn't always the best way.
As a poet and as a writer, what's your advice to younger poets, the fresh faces getting out there?
There's no better advice than to just read. Read absolutely everything. Read the best. Read the people that they say are the best. Don't read anything modern, anything new. Don't read anybody that's written in the last 30 years. Just read the classics over and over and over and over. And when you understand that, when you get what they're doing, then move on. But yeah, I had a professor who said, the old adage is to write what you know. The trick is to then try to know everything. And that's true. To write what I've experienced is very limited, but to try and experience everything as you can, you want to write about it. And so going out there, living, that's the main thing, living and getting your heart broken and working and seeing people and encountering things and writing about them. And, that's the greatest advice you can have. I think it was Keats who said that a poet is the least poetic creature that there is. We're pale, sitting in the library, writing about the same thought that we had 15 years ago, trying to fine-tune that poem with that one right word. And it's true, for the most part. A few scraped knees and bruises, a bar fight or two, that helps out a lot. Absolute honesty. Absolute fidelity to who you are, what you've seen, what you think. On the page, in performance, that's another thing. That's an important ingredient that cannot be undervalued. Imagination is important, but honesty over everything else. That's the only other advice.